Eileen Phillipson. Good morning, good afternoon. My name is Eileen Phillipson. I'm a psychoanalyst in Oakland, California, and I'd like to welcome you all to today's event. I'd like to start off by thanking Kurt Jacobson and David Morgan from Free Associations for sponsoring this event. And I'd also like to thank Neil McLaughlin for hosting us from McMaster University. We're going to take about 2 hours today. Whether or not we use all of that, we do want to reserve that for Dan's talk, Dawn's discussion, and then we want to open it up for Q&A. And how we're going to do that is we urge you to put any questions or comments you may have in the chat function. And then I and Neil will be monitoring that throughout the presentation. And we'll read your questions to Dan and Dawn. And so what brings us here today, I think, is a mutual interest in what we consider the crisis of psychoanalysis, brought about by, most recently, the fracturing of the American Psychoanalytic Association. That has been, I think, very disturbing to many of us due to the fact that the American has been the organizational background, or backbone, I should say, of American psychoanalysis for over 100 years. And whether or not it can survive the current division and acrimony is a real question. And also, what has happened in the American is being reflected in other organizations like Division 39 of the APA, and also in institutes throughout the United States. So our event is intended to create a space for free inquiry. And that, I think, has been in short supply in our unmoderated listservs. And I really hope that this will be an opportunity for us to think together about what's happening in our field. To that end, I would like to introduce our featured speaker, Daniel Burston, who is an associate professor and former chair of the Department of Psychology at Duquesne University. He holds a PhD in social and political thought and a PhD in psychology. He is the author of numerous books and journal articles on the history of psychoanalysis. Most recently, he's written in very short succession, I might add, Psychoanalysis, Politics, and the Postmodern University, Anti-Semitism and Analytic Psychology, that is Jung, Politics, and Culture, and most recently, with John Mills, Critical Theory and Psychoanalysis from the Frankfurt School to Contemporary Critique. Dan.
Thank you, Eileen, and welcome everybody. I'm glad that we have such a robust turnout today. As Eileen mentioned, many observers today believe that American psychoanalysis is in crisis and that the future of the profession is quite possibly hanging in the balance. And there's many dimensions to this crisis, more than we can do justice to here. But let's recall that from its inception, psychoanalysis sought to increase the individual's self-knowledge and their capacity for rational choice, operating on the assumption that these help to free the patient from morbid fears, inhibitions, obsessions, and compulsions, from baffling psychogenic symptoms, and from character traits that are rooted in arrested development. Insights derived from analytic work were then applied to ameliorating persistent problems in the patient's interpersonal relationships. So for the sake of convenience, let's just refer to this as the traditional model. By contrast with the traditional model, critical social justice theory is a much more recent approach, which insists that the patient's psychological growth depends chiefly on their acquiring insight into their positionality vis-a-vis oppressed racial and sexual minorities and the predominantly white, male, heteronormative, and cisgender groups that presumably oppress them. Once acquired, this insight presumably enables patients to overcome their sense of powerlessness and passivity and become active agents of social change. Now, what exactly is critical social justice theory? According to most observers, it's an approach that evolved gradually from the liberation psychology of Ignacio Martin Barro, but which became intricately and intimately intertwined with ideas and positions from critical race theory, queer theory, the boycott, divest, and sanctions, and decolonization movements. And while all of these movements originate in the late 20th century, they only coalesced in their present form in the 21st century, when they started to transform university curricula across domains and disciplines in sometimes very radical ways. Meanwhile, remember that long before the rise of critical social justice theory, left-leaning analysts had always stressed the importance of overarching social, economic, and political trends in shaping their patients' lives. In the early 20th century, Otto Gross, Wilhelm Reich, and Erich Fromm were all sharply critical of capitalism and what they refer to as the patriarchal authoritarian character and the ways in which these thwarted the struggle for democracy, for racial equality, for sexual freedom, and for women's rights. But the more overtly political people like these became, the more they tended to become outliers in the psychoanalytic world, with the result that several of them were expelled from Freud's inner circle and the International Psychoanalytic Association. The remarkable thing about this moment in history is that the number of critical social justice theory oriented clinicians has now reached a critical mass. And as a result, they're mobilizing to completely flip the script on adherence to the traditional model. Instead of marginalizing radicals and activists, as was formerly often the case, the new trend is to normalize and empower them and to marginalize and sometimes vilify analysts who still adhere to versions of the more traditional models and methods of treatment. Freud would never have approved of this direction, but that shouldn't deter psychoanalysts from changing course if circumstances warrant. And let's be frank, whatever else we can say about it, traditional psychoanalysis has long had a diversity problem. Broad recruitment strategies have been increasing for some time now, beginning with the recruitment of women and gay people some decades ago. But more needs to be done because the recruitment and training of African-American candidates still lags far behind. Meanwhile, however, there's now considerable conflict within psychoanalytic organizations, which are witnessing increasingly sharp and increasingly frequent internal conflicts over the rules, roles, and protocols that govern clinical training and the organizational structure within their respective credentialing bodies. These intense and acrimonious exchanges are fueled by the disparate perspectives that critical social justice and oriented analysts and more traditional analysts bring to bear on the sources of interpersonal conflict. Put simply, by virtue of their training and education, traditional analysts are apt to interpret intense, prolonged, and seemingly intractable interpersonal conflict as the result of transference and countertransference, unmet childhood needs, unresolved conflicts stemming from the Oedipal period or before, and secondary gain of one sort and another. And by the way, when I refer to interpersonal conflicts, I mean those between analysts and their patients, between analysts and their trainees, and between analysts of different ethnic or racial backgrounds. In short, traditional analysts tend to render interpersonal conflicts intelligible or tend to interpret them in light of the developmental histories of those concerned. Now, by contrast, critical social justice theorists and therapists construe most conflictual situations or relationships that occur in group settings, including those between training analysts and analysts, therapists and patients, younger and older analysts, as the microsocial replication or enactments of patterns of systemic racism or unequal power relations that favor the more powerful and usually white analysts. And let's be honest, race-related interpersonal conflicts are quite prevalent in our society. They occur in families, the workplace, the schoolyard, the neighborhood, NGOs, political and religious organizations, sports and entertainment worlds. So when patients encounter racial discrimination or harassment in their daily lives, it is necessary to contextualize them in an understanding of structural and unconscious racism or unconscious racism. But it's less useful to impose that model on problematic interactions among colleagues in the analytic world, especially when it undermines collegiality and robs those who are accused of racism of the benefit of the doubt. That being said, we need to acknowledge that both the traditional and the critical social justice paradigms or models for rendering internecine conflict intelligible have considerable strengths and weaknesses. Applied judiciously, the traditional model sheds considerable light on the protagonist's inner worlds, that is to say, the unconscious motives and fantasies that inform and accompany some of the accusations or complaints that may be directed at the elders in the psychoanalytic world. Applied carelessly, however, it can also be used by these same elders to trivialize or to dismiss genuine social problems, grievances, and concerns of their members. Conversely, critical social justice theory obligates people to think about their relationships to their social, political, and economic environments and how these distort human subjectivity and human relationships. But because of its focus on the present day and the so-called outer world, critical social justice theory can also ignore, overlook, or minimize the inner or intrapsychic dimension that often accompanies conflicts like these. So the crisis of psychoanalysis is attributable in part to the fact that each side is alert to the downside of the other party's explanatory models or biases, but often oblivious or defensive regarding the potential drawbacks of their own. So, prompted by growing unrest amongst its members, the executive board of the American Psychoanalytic Association affirmed the validity of both of these hermeneutic paradigms in a letter to the membership dated March 27, 2023. The board wrote, and I quote, "The intrapsychic and social context are inseparable and contained within every clinical interaction, whether consciously addressed or unconsciously enacted." It continues, "We further acknowledge that racialized enactments are ubiquitous and unavoidable and cause pain. And as psychoanalysts, we hold the stance that working through and the work of repair are necessary when they occur." Now, close quote. Now, granted, analysts may address their patients, trainees, or colleagues in ways that are colored by unconscious racial biases, and these problematic exchanges need to be addressed when they occur. But stipulating across the board that the two hermeneutic models are inseparable or contained in every clinical interaction seems somewhat contrived and risks oversimplifying or glossing over some potentially serious problems. Why? Well, because in the present climate, when a patient, trainee, or colleague alleges that their analyst or colleague is manifesting unconscious racial bias, the accuser's personal grievances, developmental issues, and the role that secondary gain plays in producing these aggrieved feelings often recede into the background. Similarly, the emphasis on the ubiquity of these problems will likely create, and indeed, I think is already creating, a climate where there are a good many false positives, by which I mean situations where the motives and utterances of analysts who are accused of racial bias have been misconstrued, but where they nevertheless feel pressure to capitulate to their accuser's claim for fear of being shamed or discredited by their peers for not taking the work of anti-racism seriously. And the result? Well, the result is that the analyst's acknowledgement of unconscious complicity and racist ideology in circumstances like these lacks authenticity. And the dynamics that shape the accuser's lived experience of the analyst go largely or completely unaddressed. Now, if this state of affairs persists for long, many competent and gifted clinicians will eventually withdraw from the field and perhaps abandon the profession altogether. Unfortunately, however, many critical social justice advocates currently refuse to consider these risks or even to discuss them constructively with their colleagues. Their attitude towards more traditional clinicians seems to be, I would sum it up in the old statement, in the old saying, good riddance to bad rubbish, get lost. So thus far, we've surmised that the traditional model has a very flawed record on issues of diversity. There's no one contests that. We've also established that the new critical social justice paradigm, which started gaining traction in 2017, is also problematic, but in ways which are, thus far at any rate, largely unaddressed. In the meantime, traditional analysts fear that the adoption of the critical social justice perspective may lead eventually to the loss of many valuable insights into patients' unique developmental pathways and the intrapsychic sources of their interpersonal conflicts and the best ways to address them therapeutically. I think that their fears on this score are justified because in the absence of a really viable synthesis or integration between the older hermeneutics of suspicion and the newer critical social justice paradigm, the critical social justice paradigm may sweep the old one away altogether or encourage its adherents to merely pay lip service to it for the sake of appearances. And the potential drawbacks, I think, of critical social justice theory are reflected in the impact of a newly famous and controversial representative of this new trend, Dr. Lara Sheeha. Lara Sheeha is the 2023 president of Division 39 of the American Psychological Association, and since 2016 has been an assistant professor of psychology at George Washington University in Washington, D.C. With her husband, Stephen Sheeha, she has co-authored a book called Psychoanalysis Under Occupation, Practicing Resistance in Palestine, and has recently appeared on several online interviews, which are now available on YouTube, to publicize their new book. But despite all that, Lara Sheeha only rose to national prominence when, in January of 2023, when Stand With Us, an NGO that combats anti-Semitism, filed a Title VI complaint with the Office of Civil Rights at the Department of Education on behalf of several of her Jewish students who claimed that Dr. Sheeha had bullied, belittled, or marginalized several Jewish students in the required diversity course that she taught at George Washington University in the fall semester of 2022. Furthermore, the complaint alleged that George Washington University had failed to address the students' complaints appropriately. Sheeha retaliated by filing charges of racism against the students. And while George Washington University dismissed the students' complaints against Sheeha, they pursued her complaints against her students. And as a result, claim the students, they were denied due process and were forced to undergo a series of Kafkaesque reconciliation sessions, as they were called, in which they were instructed to reflect on their sins, admit their wrongdoing, and chart a path to self-improvement, or in other words, redemption. If they did not comply, the students said they were threatened with receiving a black mark on their academic record, which would effectively preclude their certification as clinicians and stymie their efforts to advance in the profession. When the Title VI complaint became public, she had declared repeatedly, and in a variety of different contexts, that her classroom conduct had been exemplary, and insisted that she was merely being silenced, and for one reason, because she was a queer Arab woman of color. The American Arab Anti-Discrimination Committee, or ADC, leapt to her defense and protested rather angrily when George Washington University hired Crowell and Mooring, an international law firm, to launch what they termed an independent inquiry into the matter. The ADC needn't have worried. Crowell and Mooring is a firm that employs over 600 people, has offices all around the world, and serves clients in industries as diverse as defense, aerospace, IT, healthcare, and last, but perhaps not least, higher education. In short, Crowell and Mooring are hired guns who routinely protect their clients' interests, regardless of their guilt or innocence. And to no one's great surprise, they exonerated George Washington University, and by implication, Dr. Sheeha, saying that there was no evidence of anti-Semitic bias or improper classroom conduct. But if that were the case, one wonders, why would George Washington University still refuse to release Crowell and Moring's full report to the general public? I'll leave that. Meanwhile, in any case, while the ADC and Crowell and Moring were manning the barricades on Sheeha's behalf, all hell was breaking loose on listservs of various psychoanalytic organizations and training institutes, including, but not limited to, Division 39 of the American Psychological Association and the American Psychoanalytic. Sheeha's defenders outnumbered her critics in these heated exchanges. But whereas they formerly objected vehemently to Crowell and Moring's pending investigation, charging that it was motivated by institutional racism, they now embraced it as an ironclad vindication of Lara Sheehy's innocence, proof, in effect, that she was being harassed by the agents of Zionism. Moreover, they objected to the fact that in light of the controversies swirling around her, the executive board of the American Psychoanalytic Association did not invite Lara Sheehy to speak at the American Psychoanalytic Association's annual conference in 2023. Now, as one APSA member, Mark Sexton, observed, when the executive committee declined to invite Sheeha to speak, and I quote, Sexton observed, some members, he says, understood this as the result of unconscious racism. This was seen as a primary cause, a fact, and not as a possibility, and no other motivating factor was considered to be valid. This judgment then generated questioning reactions from members who held a multi-determined view, that unconscious racism may be motivating this decision, but so might other conscious and unconscious thoughts. The social as primary members were hurt by these challenges and saw this as further evidence of unconscious racism and pressured the leadership to resign. Members who were accused of unconscious racism as fact and not as a possibility were also hurt. My thesis is that the core issue generating these opposing interpretations and reactions seems to be different beliefs regarding whether psychic life and organizations are multi-determined or are primarily determined by social factors. Sexton continues, he wrote, if the social turn means a recognition that social determinants exist in a dynamic interaction with all the other conscious and unconscious determinants, then this is an important corrective to psychoanalytic theory. However, the social as primary perspective, by which he means what I'm calling the critical social justice theory perspective, is not a corrective. It replaces uncertainty and complexity with certitude and replaces a non-judgmental attitude with moralism. Now, I wouldn't have phrased it exactly this way myself, but Sexton has a point. Ever since Freud addressed the overdetermination of dream symbols and parapraxis, psychoanalysis has favored a multifactorial rather than a monocausal approach to the elucidation of unconscious mental processes. And for the past 5 decades at least, the prevailing consensus in the analytic community was that the analytic work renders analysans more aware of and more attuned to, more tolerant of ambiguity, complexity, and uncertainty, and less inclined to simplistic or binary either-or explanations. Proponents of critical social justice theory sometimes seem to forget this when they, for example, when they attempt to explain complex or ambiguous interactions by recourse to nebulous abstractions like white culture or black culture. After all, if you think about it seriously, there really is no such thing as white culture, singular. Rather, there is a multitude, or there are a multitude of cultures amongst people of white skin. Consider the obvious differences, for example, between French, German, Spanish, Italian, and Greek-speaking cultures, and the difference between each of these and the diverse cultures that prevail in the Anglosphere, England, Scotland, Ireland, North America, Australia, New Zealand, et cetera, et cetera. And the same is true of Eastern Europe as well. Also, consider the stark regional differences in one of the same countries, such as the United States or Canada, or even Spain, as well as across continents. So the term Black culture is also problematic because there's a multitude of different Black cultures across the different parts of Africa, the Caribbean, and the Americas. Trying to force them all into a single binary white culture versus Black culture implies the opposite, namely that these diverse cultures are somehow monolithic or homogeneous. And this kind of overly simplistic and reductionistic thinking lends itself to making invidious comparisons between racial groups, but it's a poor substitute for genuine cultural analysis. In any case, the acrimony that Sexton describes in the American Psychoanalytic Association was exacerbated by the announcement from the Holmes Commission, which strongly supported Shiha's claim that she was the victim of racism. The Holmes Commission, officially called the Commission on Racial Equality in the psychoanalytic profession, was created in the wake of the murder of George Floyd. It released a preliminary report in 2021 accusing both the American psychoanalytic and the profession as a whole of structural racism, lending considerable support to Shiha's own view of her case. And that conclusion was reinforced by the Holmes Commission's final report issued on Juneteenth of this year. But 3 days before the Holmes Commission issued its final report on Friday, June 16th, 2023, The Guardian published an article by J. Oliver Conroy entitled "Inside the War, Tearing Psychoanalysis Apart," and then I quote, "the most hatred I've ever witnessed." Now, I believe that this is an article that many of you have read or at least heard about. In it, Conroy describes the acrimonious exchanges between the pro and anti-Shiha factions vividly. And in an effort to round out his portrait of Shiha, he cited fragments from Shiha's deleted Twitter account, which was an unusual move given that Shiha and her defenders deplore critics who cite her tweets, labeling them this practice as unfair and racist. Nevertheless, Conroy shared the following tweet, deleted tweet from Shiha's account. It reads, "If you still," and the word "still" is in all capitals, all caps, "if you still entertain, even for a split second, that Hamas is a terrorist entity, there is literally zero hope for you, your soul, or your general existence as an ethical human being in the world." Close quote. I commend Conroy for bringing this Twitter quote to light, but I don't agree with his way of framing her remarks here. Why? Well, because according to Conroy, Shiha merely believes that, as he says it, that some human beings are beyond redemption. Well, fair enough, up to a point. But she also specifically states that people who entertain the idea that Hamas is a terrorist organization, even for a split second, are hopeless cases, are lost souls who forfeited any vestiges of ethical integrity they may have once had. Now, it's not clear to me who authorized Shiha to say which thoughts clinicians may or may not entertain without putting their souls in peril, but the idea that entertaining certain thoughts in consciousness automatically disqualifies one from being an ethical or worthwhile human being, and by implication, perhaps, a competent clinician, it runs completely contrary to the basic rule of psychoanalysis and the technique of free association. It also has chilling Orwellian overtones, suggesting that some pseudo-leftist cultural superego is required to censor our unruly inner thoughts and feelings to prevent us from committing thought crimes. Nevertheless, for the sake of argument, let's concede that the issue on Hamas is moot. After all, one man's terrorist is another man's freedom fighter. Just consider the history of the 20th century. By dint of circumstances and changing political conditions, Menachem Begin was widely condemned as a terrorist until he wasn't, as were Fidel Castro, Nelson Mandela, Robert Mugabe, Yasser Arafat, Daniel Ortega, and the list goes on and on. So, unfortunately, a troubling number of these self-styled freedom fighters proved to be aspiring tyrants and left-wing authoritarians, but that, as they say, is another story. Nevertheless, the fact remains that currently, the governments of the United States, the United Kingdom, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, the European Union, and several Scandinavian countries all deem Hamas to be a terrorist organization. Meanwhile, the governments of Russia, China, North Korea, Cuba, Iran, Syria, and Turkey do not. So on reflection, Most countries that deem Hamas to be a terrorist organization are democracies, albeit flawed democracies, some more flawed than others, of course. By contrast, many countries that do not deem Hamas to be a terrorist organization are governed by some of the most belligerent and bloodthirsty regimes on the face of the planet, that crush dissent and democratic movements within their borders with a brazen disregard for human life and human rights. That being the case, if the possibility that Hamas is indeed, perhaps, a terrorist organization never crosses your mind, or if your assessment of Hamas aligns squarely with Shia's and by implication with Russia's, China's, the governments of Russia, China, North Korea, Syria, Iran, and so on, if that's the case, perhaps you should ask yourself why that is the case and whether you're really comfortable with this state of affairs. And if you are comfortable with it, perhaps you should ask yourself whether your complacency on this score is a product of unconscious mental processes that render this state of affairs egosyntonic. Perhaps without realizing it, you harbor authoritarian tendencies that render you unwilling or unable to bring your critical faculties to bear on the issue. Or perhaps your critical faculties have merely been lulled to sleep. Why? Well, because whether Hamas is a terrorist organization or not, there is no denying that Hamas is an Islamist as opposed to Islamic organization, which, like the Taliban and in Afghanistan and the Iranian regime, is a theocratic, misogynistic, and fiercely anti-LGBTQA+ organization. Furthermore, like the Taliban and the Iranian regime, it is bitterly resented and mistrusted by most of the people who are subject to its rule. Moreover, Hamas and its supporters have publicly and persistently flogged the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, one of Hitler's favorite books, and which is required reading for every budding anti-Semite, as an authentic historical document rather than the slanderous fabrication concocted by the Tsarist police to justify horrific pogroms perpetrated against Jews in Eastern Europe. The Hamas charter, in fact, reads in part, and I quote, "With their money, they took control of the world media, of news agencies, the press, publishing houses, broadcasting stations, and others. With their money, they stirred revolutions in various parts of the world with the purpose of achieving their interests and reaping the fruit therefrom. They were behind the French Revolution, the Communist Revolution, and most of the revolutions we heard and hear about here and there. With their money, they formed secret societies such as Freemasons, Rotary clubs, the Lions, and others in other parts of the world for the purpose of sabotaging society and achieving their Zionist interests." This is the Hamas charter. So Hamas is not merely an anti-Zionist organization. It's also blatantly anti-Semitic, as indeed all Islamist organizations are. Nevertheless, many on the left today coddle or cozy up to them. And judging from many of her tweets and public pronouncements, Shia seems intent on transforming the passive acceptance or tacit support of such groups on the left into a full-fledged and unapologetic embrace of them. Demonizing Zionism, even in its most progressive forms, while dismissing criticism of Islamist groups as Islamophobic, which has become a common and lamentable pattern on the left nowadays. Another revealing statement called from Shia's book, and not from her deleted Twitter account, but from her book, is her oft-repeated claim that Zionism is a form of mental illness. Really? Well, this is tantamount to saying that the vast majority of Jews are mentally ill, since roughly 80% of us, that is to say the vast majority, do embrace some form of Zionism. Now, just imagine the utter pandemonium that would ensue if I countered Shia's claim by saying the vast majority of Muslims are mentally ill too. We all know what would happen next. Shia and her supporters would immediately label me as an Islamophobe, and rightly so. And in the present climate, my utterance would probably cost me my academic post, my license to practice. At the very least, it would obligate me to make a public apology and undergo a lengthy course of re-education. But does the same logic and do the same penalties apply to Shia? Apparently not. Now, to grasp what is at stake in the longer term, consider what the consequences for psychoanalysis would be if most clinicians and clinical educators embraced Shiha's claim that Zionism is a form of psychosis. On the face of it, that would make most Jews very poor candidates for analytic training, wouldn't it? Only Jews who have repudiated Zionism or never embraced it in the first place would stand a reasonable chance of getting trained, because committees that evaluate candidates for training would be prejudiced against Zionists, regardless of where they stand in relationship to the government of Israel and its policies, in relationship to their relationship to the Palestinian people. And this prejudice need never be codified publicly to have an appreciable impact on the selection of candidates for training. Why? Because Shia goes well beyond offering a model of the therapist activist as a viable career option, one that many consider a matter of personal choice, and effectively demands its adoption throughout the mental health field. In a videotaped interview for Jewish Voices for Peace that aired earlier this year, she has said, "This is my own urgent call for the clinicians among us. From the river to the sea, we must center Palestine in every effort, and we must support boycott, divest, and sanction efforts, despite threats and efforts to derail solidarity. This needs to be done not as an offshoot of our clinical work, but as a central working tenet of any clinical practice that purports to be interested in alleviating the suffering of others." Now, anyone who knows me or the work I've done over the last almost 4 decades of scholarship knows that I have nothing against activist clinicians. I've published books and articles about several of them, Wilhelm Reich, Eric Fromm, R.D. Laing among them. Nevertheless, calling on clinicians to center Palestine in every effort, as Shia says, and to treat the Palestinian people's struggle as a central working tenet of any clinical practice is extremely problematic, because training in psychoanalysis should not demand adherence to any specific political ideology as a precondition for training, nor should it demand that practitioners become activists as well as clinicians. On the contrary, becoming an activist clinician should always remain a matter of individual choice and personal conscience. Furthermore, clinician activists in the USA, if they choose to, can focus on a wide range of issues, including mass incarceration, gun violence, climate change, income inequality, homelessness, and so on, without centering Palestine in their every effort. Statements like these demonstrate how easily the desire to collapse the distinction between clinical work and activism, rather than combining these two roles judiciously, which is a choice I fully support, lends itself to political manipulation and machinations of various kinds. Thanks very much.
Thank you so much, Dan. That was an extremely powerful presentation, and I appreciate it. So let us now turn to Don Carveth, who is Emeritus Professor of Sociology and Social and Political Thought at York University in Toronto. He is a training and supervising analyst in the Canadian Institute of Psychoanalysis, a past director of the Toronto Institute, and past editor-in-chief of the Canadian Journal of Psychoanalysis. He is in private practice of psychoanalysis in Toronto. Don.
Thank you. Am I unmuted?
Yes.
Good. Okay. Thank you, Eileen. Thanks, Dan. So let me begin by congratulating Dan on the clarity and comprehensiveness of his articulation of a complex set of concepts and events. His outline of the two theoretical frameworks, the traditional psychodynamic and CSJT, critical social justice theory, and the conflict around them is very helpful. I agree with Dan that it is simplistic to think that we can resolve the conflict simply by saying both perspectives are necessary. It is, of course, true that both are necessary, but there are people who appear to deny this complementarity, and some seem more than ready to relegate traditional psychoanalysis to the dustbin of history. Although I am a practitioner of the traditional model, I had prior training as a sociologist and can claim some familiarity with critical social theory and analysis of class, racial, gender, and generational conflict. But when I argue that both the psychodynamic and the CSJT models are necessary, I mean they need to be negated, preserved, and elevated into a higher order synthesis that transcends the current splitting, the either-or thinking that characterized what Melanie Klein called the paranoid schizoid position. Freud was very aware of the profound resistance to psychoanalysis, especially in America. I personally encountered this resistance when in the early 1970s, I wanted to write a doctoral dissertation in sociology addressing psychoanalysis. At that time, sociology and psychoanalysis mixed about as well as oil and water. But thanks to the work of Dennis Fromm, a very rare specimen at the time, a psychoanalytically oriented sociologist, I was able to do so by elaborating on his classic work on the over-socialized conception of man in modern sociology, 1961. But those of us who were critical of extreme social determinism and social relativism in psychosocial sciences, well, we merely made a dent. The rise of postmodernism and posthumanism simply intensified the resistance to the idea of a human nature and a human psyche irreducible and resistant to socialization. In what has been called the unhappy divorce between sociology and psychoanalysis, the perspective of the former pretty much won the day. Although Erich Fromm rejected the biologistic elements of the traditional Freudian model and is often mistakenly associated with the so-called culturistic school of psychoanalysis, he actually resisted both biological and sociological reductionism, and like Marx, defended the idea of a universal core of human nature that manifests itself differently under different social and historical conditions. At the same time, Fromm presented an existential Freudo-Marxism that posits a degree of subjective freedom and responsibility in the face of biological and social forces. But from the 1960s on, within psychoanalysis itself, revisionist perspectives, self-psychology, relational and intersubjectivity theory, trauma theory, etc., displaced or marginalized core Freudian and Kleinian insights into the unconscious passions and fantasies that resist socialization and manifest in various forms of destructiveness towards self and others. But as Freud understood, resistance to the unconscious does not make the unconscious disappear. In the late 1960s, some feminists found that despite thorough consciousness raising, they had failed to transcend patriarchal themselves attracted only to sexist men, or plagued by persistent, erotically charged rape fantasies. Hence, writers such as Juliet Mitchell recognized that an additional project of unconsciousness raising was essential and turned to psychoanalysis. So today's advocates of CSJT will find that however thorough their exploration of their intersectionality, their social location in terms of race, gender, class, etc., while certainly necessary and helpful, will not cure all their psychopathology, their obsessions, compulsions, addictions, perversions, anxiety, depression, and other symptoms. Realizing this, many will be forced to turn to psychoanalysis. Hence, I'm not afraid that psychoanalysis will disappear. People who suffer from disorders of the soul will always seek out soul doctors for help. But in the meantime, a great deal of damage may be done to the institutions, especially the training institutions of psychoanalysis. Not that these institutions are not in need of reform, or that CSJT cannot contribute to the necessary critique of the elements of patriarchal authoritarianism, classism, racism, sexism, heterosexism, and normopathy from which these institutions still suffer. For decades, we have suffered from what Russell Jacoby described as the social amnesia, in which society remembers less and less, faster and faster. But there are crucial psychoanalytic insights we cannot afford to forget, but that we have, for many years already, been forgetting. I think it needs to be recognized that prior to the recent rise of CSJT, the theoretical and clinical core of psychoanalysis, its focus on listening with the third ear to the asocial and antisocial elements of the unconscious, its hermeneutics of suspicion, has been increasingly displaced in favor of less disturbing, more hopeful, and pro-social visions of human nature, and more relational therapeutic approaches emphasizing empathic attunement to the patient's conscious and pre-conscious experience, rather than attempting to bring what is warded off and unconscious into the light. Why such profound resistance to core Freudian and Kleinian insights? One reason is that the revisionist models are simple and easy to learn. You don't have to be a scholar to understand the self-object bond or the need for therapeutic empathy. Freudian and Kleinian insight into our darkness and the complex, overdetermined causes of our suffering is both personally and intellectually challenging. Many well-meaning folks who want to be helpers are frankly not equipped to understand, let alone master, the complexities and subtleties of Freudian and Kleinian theory and practice. It is much easier to glom on to a simplistic theory and assure oneself that therapeutic practice requires little more than being a nice person who is woke and has the correct political outlook. Here are a few quotations that align with the spirit of the traditional model. First, from Jacques Lacan, quotes, "The basic thing about analysis is that people finally realize that they've been talking nonsense at full volume for years," unquote. Seneca, "Let wickedness escape as it may at the bar, it never fails of doing justice upon itself, for every guilty person is his own hangman." Now Shakespeare, Hamlet, Act 2, Scene 2, quotes, "Use every man after his desert, and who would escape whipping?" St. Paul, Romans 7:19, "For the good that I would, I do not, but the evil that I would not, that I do." Finally, Freud to Jung, as their ship enters New York Harbor in 1909, "They don't realize that we are bringing them the plague." Well, what plague? Recognition of our inherent contradictoriness, our shadow self, our narcissism and limited capacity for concern, our profound self-deception and hypocrisy. In contrast, the following quotation from Shakespeare, King Lear, Act 3, Scene 2, conveys the spirit of much revisionist psychoanalysis, including CSJT. Quotes, "I am a man more sinned against than sinning." Since the early 1960s, the rise of interpersonal, intersubjective, and relational model theories in psychoanalysis replaced the traditional model's concern with unconscious guilt and self-punishment with a discourse of victimization at the hands of not good enough mothers, absent authoritarian or abusive fathers, etc. But while trauma and environmental failure and injustice certainly exist, they generate rage, mostly directed back against the self. The idea that most human suffering directly results from failures of provision encourages ideas of therapy as provision rather than analysis of the profound self-destructiveness, what Bion called the ego-destructive superego, resulting from trauma. My point is that revisionist psychoanalysis had already laid the foundation for CSJT. As I have argued elsewhere, the evasion of guilt, the superego, and the conscience, the psychic regulators in psychoanalysis, paralleled the attack on regulation and regulators characteristic of neoliberalism. Here, as Marx predicted, the ideological superstructure of which psychoanalysis is a part is, in the last analysis, determined by the socioeconomic substructure. But the evasion of guilt in society and psychoanalysis does not eliminate guilt and self-punishment. As the traditional psychoanalytic model taught us, very often traumatized people unconsciously contrive to re-find and perpetuate their childhood pain, sometimes finding themselves victimized again, sometimes reversing roles and identifying with the aggressor. While reflection upon our positionality and intersectionality will certainly contribute to necessary self-knowledge and insight into social and intergenerational factors in the unconscious compulsion to repeat, neglect of other factors contributing to such overdetermined phenomena will preclude anything approximating a cure. When people realize this, they will seek out psychoanalysis. Thank you.
Thank you, Don. Before we get to bringing in questions, I feel it incumbent upon me as a relational psychoanalyst to suggest that I think the twinning of wokeness and the relational turn is a mistake, because I think that what you're calling the revisionists have been some of the most following in Fromm's footsteps, some of the most vocal proponents of people taking responsibility for themselves and not being mere victims. You know, I think of Jessica Benjamin's insistence on the development of a third, Lou Aron's critique of simple binaries and either or thinking, Erwin Hoffman's belief that the fundamental nature of human experience is ambiguous rather than having a simplistic view. I think following in the tradition of Erich Fromm, who very much believed that individuals have responsibility for their actions. I think it's counter to this view of seeing everyone as victims, I think, as Dan so beautifully pointed out. But Dan, I want to ask you to weigh in on this. If you have any thoughts about current psychoanalysis and and psychoanalytic theory and the relationship to critical social justice theory.
Well, to be honest with you, Eileen, I'm not really all that well versed in contemporary psychoanalysis.
Okay.
I devoted much of my career to studying the history of psychoanalysis, and I am interested and engaged with various schools of contemporary psychoanalysis, but I'm not. I wouldn't feel comfortable making big, broad statements along these lines. I will say that I think that the core issue that Dawn is calling attention to, namely the neglect of guilt and conscience, and of intrapsychic conflict, as opposed to trauma, that these are dimensions of psychoanalytic theory which have been eclipsed by some of the contemporary schools, and I think we need to sort of visit. That doesn't negate the value of relational psychoanalysis or self-psychology or any other school of contemporary psychoanalysis. But I think that has sort of dropped off a lot of analysts' radar. And along with this, and I'm probably going to sound like a broken record to some of you who are familiar with, I've said this before many times, along with this is a shocking ignorance of Freud's work. You know, one of the strangest things that to me is to meet a newly minted psychoanalyst. I've just been recently credentialed, who hardly has ever read any Freud in the original. And that's not, and I wrote my dissertation on Erich Fromm. I've written about all, well, not all, but many of the dissidents in psychoanalysis in the 20th century. So I'm not trying to idealize Freud. I've been very critical of him in the past, and I remain so in the present. But Freud should be a touchstone. I mean, to drop Freud out of the curriculum in psychoanalytic training institutes seems to me to be a huge mistake. And I'm relieved to say that here in Pittsburgh, that's not how the Pittsburgh psychoanalytic does it. Here in Pittsburgh, if you go through the training, you get a thorough immersion in Freud, and it's not indoctrination. You know, you're permitted to grapple with it and come to your own conclusions, but at least you know what you're talking about, you know, at least you have a chance to come to grips with Freud's notions of unconscious guilt. I'd like to add one further, at the risk of going on too long, very quickly. I'd like to add a further note that Don has made a very important distinction in his work, The Still Small Voice, between the superego and conscience proper. And Erich Fromm actually talks about this in his distinction between authoritarian conscience and humanistic conscience. This is essentially the same thing we're talking about. There's a difference between the part or the aspect of our conscience which engages in prohibition and punishment, and the part that inspires us to pro-social act and altruistic activities. They're different things. Lumping them in the same singular entity. They're both regulators, to use Don's terminology. They're both regulators of our behavior. So, and I think that we need to separate those ideas out, but we mustn't lose sight of the importance of guilt.
Okay, so maybe in another forum we can talk about contemporary psychoanalytic theories, and do they or do they not, as I would argue, agree with critical social justice movements. I want to now just a question came in about how do we ask questions. Just put them into the chat, and I would like to direct to both Dan and Don Kerry Nelson's question, and he's asking, could you speak directly to of how CJT may be, what are the dangers of it for analytic training? Can you speak to that? I mean, I think you were talking about things that are relevant to it, but would you say specifically, and this is for Don as well, how you see this negatively impacting analytic training?
I think Don should go first here.
Okay.
Don't mind.
Okay. Well, CJST directs our attention correctly. Our attention needs to be directed toward the contemporary world, toward contemporary trauma, toward contemporary injustice. But psychoanalytic training requires us to realize that the external social world, while it is real and it must be attended to, there is an inner world. Psychoanalytic training, to a very large extent, is trying to teach us something that we don't learn really anywhere else, or hardly anywhere else, which is this inner world of feeling and fantasy and passions, a very non-rational, Freud called it primary process thinking. It's the world that produces our dreams. So it's a turning inward. Now, I'm not celebrating turning inward as such and turning away from the real world, the political world, the world of social injustice, climate change, and all of the other things. But to be a psychoanalyst is to not allow oneself to be so totally distracted and preoccupied with the external world because one has chosen a profession that involves exploration of the inner world and bringing it to consciousness. So in this sense, I think CJST represents a potential huge distraction from the task of analytic training. Yeah.
Dan, do you have anything to add to that?
I think that there's a number of, I've sort of alluded to this in my presentation previously. I think there's a danger in critical social justice theory twin dangers of resorting to dogmatism and to binary thinking, both of which are sort of, in my estimation, sort of run contrary to the whole analytic attitude. Now, I don't train analysts. I'm not an analyst myself, but I've studied the field now for I've studied it for 40 years, written about it for almost 40 years. And I believe that those tendencies within critical social justice theory towards dogmatism and binary thinking, and by implication, and as a result, self-righteousness and an implacable an inability to dialogue with someone whom you disagree with, those are potentially, they're not good for any kind of clinical training, in my estimation, not just for psychoanalytic training, but any kind of training in clinical psychology. So that's my short answer.
Can I just respond to that, Eileen, briefly?
Sure, yes.
I really agree with you, Dan, but regrettably, I'm forced to acknowledge that there's plenty of dogmatism among the authorities, the training analysts who run the psychoanalytic institutions. I mean, I completely agree with you about the danger of self-righteousness and splitting and all of that, and we find plenty of that. I agree with you among the CSGT people, but to our shame, we occasionally, more than occasionally, find it among the senior authorities who are running the psychoanalytic training institutions. So
I agree.
Yeah.
I don't disagree. I think that I think we have enough of that already. We don't need a new sort of brand of dogmatism. Yes, I agree. I agree with you, Don.
Neil?
Yes,
Please.
I'm just going to read a question from Dan Warner, and it's there's really maybe two questions here, but one is, he says, as someone who has read Sheehy's work, I think she's been misrepresented on several fronts. She's a very sophisticated theorist, and they are very attentive to the connections between social and personal, the social and the personal. Certainly, she's anti-Israel, but I don't see these other criticisms people have her work. And I think much has been made of this deleted tweet of hers, and we get more empathy to why she might have said that. So maybe we could separate those two questions and first talk about the work, the sophistication of the work, and then maybe talk about the tweet after. Dan?
That's for Dan.
Okay.
Well, her book, the book that she co-authored with her husband Stephen, is fairly well written. I don't find her case formulations entirely persuasive. She links the mental suffering of three case histories in particular directly back to the occupation, by which she means not simply the occupation of the West Bank, but the very existence of Israel. Israel itself is part of what she conceives of as the occupation. I think that in only in one of those cases do I find that interpretation somewhat persuasive. I think in the other two cases that she talks about, and I'm not speaking as a clinician. Other clinicians, people who are clinicians who've read her book, should feel free to speak up on this issue if they agree or disagree with me. But myself and my my colleague Carrie find that there's the connection between the occupation and two of the three central case histories. It's really very tenuous, or maybe non-existent. The most of the suffering for two out of the three patients she discusses at length can be attributed simply to family dynamics and the problems that reside have been part of Palestinian culture since long before the creation of the State of Israel in 1948. So I'm not as impressed as my friend Dan Warner with the quality of her clinical work, and I think that he underestimates. Sorry, Dan, but I have to be blunt about this. I think that he underestimates the extent to which she demonizes Zionism in all its forms and dismisses it as psychosis or mental illness. He underestimates the extent to which that can be a harmful as well as an irresponsible position to take, for reasons I alluded to in my talk, because people who are enamored, for lack of a better word, who are enamored or inspired by Shia, will take this seriously, and they'll dismiss the most progressive kinds of Zionists as being unsuitable candidates for training. And as I said before, this is a form of prejudice. People who are selecting candidates for analytic training should not be prejudiced in this way against people who have a particular political ideology. The other thing is that with reference to the tweets, I believe that that's fair game. I mean, I believe that she meant what she said in that tweet about Hamas, and I believe that the objections that I put forward to her, to the tacit implications of her remark, are valid. I think that she does have a tendency, and it isn't just that tweet, it's multiple tweets and many statements that she makes in her YouTube videos online. She tends to be very protective of organizations like Hamas and Hezbollah, organizations that are widely deemed to be terrorist in the West. She treats any criticism of them as actually or incipiently Islamophobic. And in other words, shielding them from criticism while demonizing Zionism. This is a very pervasive tendency on the left. She's very good at it, and I find it disturbing. I guess that's how I would answer.
We have yeah.
Can I?
Don.
I'm not addressing Shihai. I have not read her work. I've been addressing only the issues of the future of psychoanalysis. But I have a couple of points about what Dan just said. To this sweeping, accusing people of Islamophobia, that the same has to be said among applies to people who, for whom any criticism of Israel is seen as anti-Semitic. I mean, it's exactly the same rhetorical move, and it's totally unjustified, and it's a symptom of authoritarianism. The second point, I know you agree with me, Dan, about that. The other point I wanted to make is more generally about trauma. You talked about the case studies she offers, she and her husband offer in the book. I'm not addressing that per se, but I'm just saying you don't need to in any way minimize the trauma that people have suffered. Sometimes the trauma that our patients have suffered is overwhelming. But psychoanalysis has to do more than empathize and help people mourn. And you have to look at the consequences of the trauma. And one of the big consequences of the trauma is murderous rage. I mean, you know, if you hit an animal, it snarls and it will bite. Traumatized people are enraged people, but they often don't know it. They don't want to know it. They will not know it. They bury it. But of course, the basic Freudian discovery is what we repressed leaks. It returns in various forms, usually self-destructive, but very often other destructive forms as well. So I think it's widespread in psychoanalysis these days. The looking away from the rage that follows from trauma.
John, thank you. I'd like to ask a question that was written by Oliver Idleton. How might the integration of activism within psychoanalysis contribute to a more complete approach to mental health treatment, empower clients, keep the field of psychoanalysis responsive to contemporary societal issues, and align with the overall goal of human well-being, even within a framework that typically emphasizes individual focus and neutrality?
That is an excellent question, Oliver, and I'm afraid I don't feel equipped to answer it. I'm not. I think that one of the problems I wrestle with when I think about these issues is the fact that analytic training is a time-consuming process. And if you're going to have a thorough immersion in Freud or some of the other psychoanalytic schools, how are you going to, unless you bring a background of activism with you into the analytic training, how are you going to synthesize and integrate them right in the analytic training? I'm not sure how that's done. But I do think it's an excellent question. It's a real challenge for the field. So I commend you for asking the question. I just have to be honest and say I don't have a clear answer for that. I will say, however, that I think some institutes are more successful than others in encouraging or at least allowing for an integration of these things. I would, and yet, with all that said, I don't think that psychoanalytic training should require people to be activists. It should permit and allow, and even in some instances, perhaps encourage people to be activists. But it shouldn't be a requirement for training, for clinical training. And I'll leave it there.
Yeah, you know what I might add to that is the Psychoanalytic Institute of Northern California has been approved by the IPA to substitute a control case for, as a candidate, you can be involved in community, some form of community clinical practice. And I think, without going into that, I think PINC, the Psychoanalytic Institute of Northern California, has given a lot of thought to this. And that is a way of participating in the community from a clinical point of view, which I think is really quite relevant to Oliver's question. I want to raise something now from Leon Hoffman. He says, psychoanalysis has a long history of real difficulty of discussing contentious issues. For example, one of the reasons for the founding of the American, as discussed by Adolf Meyer, was that analysts needed a place where they could discuss issues without constantly being on the defensive. Interesting. At that point, it was the issue of infantile sexuality. Is the current difficulty in discussing difference substantively different from previous disagreements which would lead to splits. I just lost that for a moment. Do either of you have an opinion on this?
John, do you want to go first, or?
I'd like to have more time to think about that question, but the first thing that pops into my mind is that maybe this is naive, but I'm certainly someone who, my background in critical social theory has led me to believe that we have been for many decades in a cultural regression. I'm a supporter of Christopher Lasch's idea of the emergence of the culture of narcissism, emerging with the shift from productive capitalism around 1950, the emergence of consumer capitalism, spend, enjoy, and it's turned us all into oral babies. Our narcissism is much worse. It's hard to have contentious discussions among narcissists. And we've all grown pathologically narcissistic. We live in a culture that is pathologically narcissistic. So how do you have discussions? I mean, a severe narcissist doesn't even really think that other people are real. It's very hard for narcissistic people to listen to others, to listen to people who disagree with me. This becomes very difficult. I imagine it was better back in the 20s, 30s, and 40s. Maybe it was better. Maybe I'm being naive. But anyway, that's my first take on that question. I wanted to add one other point about being an engaged, socially, politically engaged analyst. I support that. I think that one can be politically engaged as an opponent of the various forces and forms of injustice that have injured our patients, while at the same time being an analyst who is helping our patients become aware of how destructive they have become through their victimization and how they're passing that on to others unconsciously. These are not mutually incompatible activities, but you got to be able to look both ways.
Yeah. Is that
Leon,
it,
Dan, go ahead.
Yeah, no, I concur with what Don has just said, although my train of thought moved on a slightly different, my initial train of thought moved on a slightly different track. Yes, I also think that we have regressed culturally, and that people nowadays are more oral, more narcissistic than their counterparts at the beginning of the 20th century. With that said, I think there's other factors involved as well. Notably that the analysts then were talking about a problem that was widely shared amongst members of their social class, and there was a certain homogeneity. All those analysts were male, they were all middle class, upper class. In the analytic world today, the psychoanalytic world of today, there's a great deal more diversity. I mean, it's still far from perfect, okay, but it's a good deal more diverse than it was back in the day. And it's not only is it more diverse, it's far more polarized politically, socially. Now, within the psychoanalytic world, I believe most people would identify as left or liberal or left, some conservatives as well, but the sort of the political center of gravity tends to be sort of progressive. We're talking about a kind of fractioning within what is the progressive, predominantly progressive profession. So narcissism certainly plays into it, but so does the fact that there is a pressure, more peer pressure, I think, to take sides, to rather than to think these things through for oneself. So, but that's not in contrast to what Dawn's saying. That's in addition to what Dawn is saying about the issue of narcissism. I think that's correct.
But a question I would have, Dan and Dawn, Leon's pointing out the difference. He's asking about the difference between a discussion of infantile sexuality and the current discussion. And I think previous controversies were around psychoanalytic theory. Mm-hmm. And these are really about the actions and oftentimes the posts that people put, that analysts are doing outside of their practice. It's about whether or not racial enactments are going on in the organization. It really isn't about substantive theory. Isn't that correct?
Yeah.
Yeah, I think you've got a point.
This is a reflection of the increased polarization in society as a whole. Right. And also as it plays out within the psychoanalytic movement. Right.
Neil, do you have a...
Yeah. Yes. Okay. So Joanne Carlisle asked a question. This focus on one critic seems to me to have missed the opportunity to have a more reflexive conversation on what critical social justice might actually offer psychoanalysis in terms of theory development. And someone in the chats agreed with that perhaps the beginnings of the two talks committee set up that focus. So and we have to acknowledge there'd be there's a space here for a larger conversation about the content of Leary's work, as well as the whole question about tweets in general and those particular tweets. But I'd like to kind of move the conversation to the second part of Joanne's question, to take up this challenge about psychoanalysis struggles to work with the impacts of institutional societal prejudice, racism and homophobia as exemplars of various kinds, never mind the struggle to work with those issues within analytic institutes themselves. So I wonder if Dan and Dawn have anything to say about that struggle to dealing with these social issues inside institutes.
Well, I'm going to start very briefly. I think that the psychoanalytic world has, despite the horrible things that were said and done in Freud's name to people in the LGBT community in the 50s, 60s, 70s by people who claim to be his followers. I think that psychoanalysis has come a long way with respect to homophobia. There are lots of gay and lesbian training analysts, presidents of psychoanalytic societies. So I think a lot of progress has been made in that respect, and it shouldn't be negated. It shouldn't be celebrated uncritically as if we've arrived, but neither should it be dismissed. Racism is a different and more complicated question. The whole issue of race is so profoundly, so explosive and difficult right now that it's hard to make progress because there's such deep mistrust and ill will, and people who how can I put this? I'm just reading Joanne's comment again. To take up the challenge about psychoanalysis struggles to work with, never mind the struggle to work within those, Well, anyway, so I guess what I'm saying is let's talk about racism and homophobia, but let's remember that considerable progress has been made with respect to homophobia. And a lot of progress remains to be, we need to do a lot more with respect to race. That said, I think that there are problems with the critical social justice theory approach to dealing with this. I think often the critical social justice theory and DEI approaches intensify rather than ameliorate the problems that they're addressing and attempting to cure.
If I can just make a related point, one of the things that's really struck me recently, and I'm very happy to see that Kurt Jacobson and David Morgan are wanting to put together a conference and a book of papers on authoritarianism, because all of these evils that get talked about, you don't hear people very often identifying the problem of authoritarianism. There is authoritarianism on the right. There is certainly authoritarianism on the left. There is authoritarianism among some of the candidates, and there is authoritarianism among some of the training analysts. Look, I think we all have an inner authoritarian. It's called the superego. And that, as you pointed out, Dan, is quite distinct from the conscience. The conscience is not authoritarian. It will call us out. It has a bite, but it's more about getting us back on the right track than it is about beating the hell out of us. The superego is an authoritarian. And one of our defenses against being attacked by our authoritarian superego is to identify with it and act it out towards others. This is the scapegoating process. Instead of getting murdered by my superego, I develop what Heinrich Racker called a mania for reproaching others. I'm disgusted by the bad behavior I see in the world all around me. And I'm not looking at my own very much. But yeah, to focus on one of the major social problems and psychological problems, authoritarianism. This would be good for both the left and the right, and the middle.
Another question from Mayor Levitin. Does psychoanalysis have anything unique to offer by way of a response to demands for social justice, irrespective of whether a given analyst is an activist or not? This is a broad question, but for those who are interested in activism, does psychoanalysis in any of its contemporary variants offer unique tools for tackling social justice issues? Even primarily, thoughts on this issue would be appreciated.
Dawn, do you want to go?
Well, one of the, I want to show Eileen that I don't demonize all revisionist relational self-psychology. I mean, look, Heinz Kohut is sitting up here on my right shoulder all of the time. And one of the things that I learned from him is that in moments of real crisis with a patient, what the analyst must do is decenter from his own perspective and immerse himself in the perspective of the patient, really opening himself up to hearing what the patient is saying and not getting busy to deliver his interpretation of the patient, but actually listening. Now, that's something that is if you understand that as a technique, that's useful in all social conflicts, family, marital, political, social. So that's something psychoanalysis can bring to social conflict, the capacity to listen. Who is the famous psychoanalyst, Vamik Volkan, who takes that psychoanalytic understanding of the listening process, he takes that to severe social conflicts. So I think that's one thing that psychoanalysis can contribute. There are other things psychoanalysis contribute that are not so welcome to be heard, though, and that is how the oppressed always turn into oppressors. No, it's politically incorrect to say that, but it's psychologically true, because even people who oppress themselves are oppressors. And everyone who has been victimized, they generally end up victimizing themselves and others as well. So that's pretty relevant psychoanalytic understanding, identification with the aggressor.
Mm. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Well, don't you both think that psychoanalysis offers a way of thinking about why so many of us in society in general are attracted to authoritarian movement analysts?
You're frozen, Eileen.
Listen, Eileen.
Yeah, speak closer to. Don't you think psychoanalysis can enable us to think in general about why people are attracted to these authoritarian viewpoints? And I think we can think about Lara Shihab, but why are so many people attracted to the moralism, the superiority, the condemnation that is ingredient, I think?
Oh dear. Frozen again.
Yeah. And the question she's asking is so important. Why are we attracted to authoritarianism? Part of the reason is that people are angry. And angry people get pleasure from identifying with leaders who are furious and who are expressing, this anger. We've always been attracted to simplistic binary views of the world: Star Wars, Luke Skywalker, Darth Vader. People go to these movies because they offer such a simplistic view of the world. It's a relief from having to deal with complexity and uncertainty. But then there's a more important reason, and that is that we all suffer from this inner authoritarian called the superego. And it can really hamper us. In the face of authoritarianism, we are often unable to protest because the authoritarians on the outside have stimulated the authoritarian on the inside. And it's like a fifth column inside me saying, how dare you speak up against? How dare you think that you know? How dare you open your mouth? So, when you encounter someone who does open her mouth loudly, that has a certain appeal, I think, to some people. But I think we need to understand how we are undermined, how our critical thinking and our critical speaking is undermined by the authoritarian within us.
So, can I respond, Don?
Yeah.
Back to Maor's original question, I just want to point out that the traditional model of psychoanalysis, as articulated by Freud and his immediate followers, the first and second generation psychoanalysts in the IPA, for the most part said, no, psychoanalysis does not have anything specific to offer in terms of activists. It was mostly dissidents within the psychoanalytic movement who, people like Wilhelm Reich and Erich Fromm, who tried to combine the roles of analyst and activist, and who suggested that, yes, psychoanalytic theory can be mined for insights into achieving social justice. So that's sort of the historical backdrop. Now, it's also the case that Reich and Fromm first articulated the notion of what they referred to as the patriarchal authoritarian character. By 1941, Fromm had stopped using the word patriarchal and simply used the word authoritarian character. And so indeed did Theodor Adorno, although for Fromm and Adorno, the notion of the patriarchy was still very much in the background. It just wasn't foregrounded in their writings because they didn't want to alienate a lot of people, and they wanted to address a very urgent problem. the psychoanalysis is really it's no longer the home of this concept of authoritarianism. There are lots of people who study authoritarianism, like Bob Altemeyer, the social psychologist out in Manitoba, who's done excellent work on right-wing authoritarianism, who completely rejects psychoanalytic theory.
But as you say, right-wing authoritarianism, the problem with Bob's work is he doesn't address left-wing authoritarianism.
Quite right, and that's what I was going to get to next. The issue, but one of the things that I think is under-thematized in psychoanalytic discourse is left-wing authoritarianism. And whereas right-wing authoritarianism is, as Don has said, very often a function of, or if not a function of, then complexly intertwined with identification with the aggressor. With left-wing authoritarianism, it's often combined with identification with the victim. And a tendency to, now, identification with the aggressor in right-wing authoritarianism begets all kinds of cognitive distortions that promote dogmatism, binary thinking, double standards, doublethink, all things that Altmeyer recognizes, although he doesn't, he's rejected psychoanalytic theory. He demonstrates these cognitive anomalies and deficits very clearly with respect to right-wing authoritarianism. But the same kinds of cognitive distortions exist on the left, but not as a function of identification with the aggressor, but of an identification or an over-identification with the victim. And that is a dynamic that is only now being addressed in the psychoanalytic literature. And I think we'll be seeing more about this, seeing more reflection and theorizing and study on this topic in years to come. I'm certainly going to be working on this issue, and I know of several others who are at work on this right now. So not all of us are psychoanalysts by any means, but we do make use of the insights, what identification, or if you prefer, over-identification with the victim can do is it can create, well, it does all the things that identification with the aggressor does with respect to our cognitive functioning. It makes us more dogmatic, more prone to binary thinking, averse to complexity, and self-righteous.
Right. But just to elaborate on your point, it's helpful to substitute the terms, instead of aggressor and victim, substitute the terms parent and child. It's very interesting how, some people seem to identify with the parental authorities. I think this is the case with many conservatives. They kind of assume God is on their side. They kind of assume they've merged with the parental authority. Many left-wing people are identified with the victim, but often they're also identified with the child. And conservatives can make radicals feel like a naughty child. The radicals' protest is undermined by the fact that when the conservative looks at him with that patronizing look, as if to say, look, we both know you're just being naughty. And a part of the radical, his superego, is joining the conservative critique, and he's feeling, well, am I being naughty? Am I rebelling for the sake of rebelling? Am I full of death wishes? Am I just a narcissist? So the radicals' protest can be undermined from the inside in this way, precisely because there is this identification with the child to some degree.
There's a couple of questions on sort of on the relationship between psychoanalysis and kind of the medical profession, and then there's a question about about narcissism and psychoanalysis as a specialized field, maybe not as equipped to dealing with broader social issues as others, maybe sociology or political science or and the like. So I wonder if any of those two questions we could hear from Dawn or Eileen or Dan.
What's the specific question about the medical side of things?
Well, there's a couple of different questions that are, but let's just sum it down to sort of our, the field's relationship to kind of the medical model.
Right. Well, I'll just say that this is certainly was true in the past. I mean, when I trained in the 1970s, I was the one non-medical person in a class of 11 psychiatrists. But boy, things have rapidly changed. We have very few psychiatrists applying in Toronto, at least for analytic training. We're always very happy when we get one or two psychiatrists who want to train, because then they become analysts who can be paid through OHIP, and that makes analysis more widely available to people here in Ontario. We're not the medically dominated field that we were decades ago, that's for sure. But then there still is medical model thinking, and psychoanalysis has gotten tied up with medical model thinking. Whether the practitioner is medical or non-medical, we still use the language often. I try to avoid it. I'm having trouble getting rid of the language of health and illness. We talk about psychopathology. We talk about people who are ill. I want to talk about people who are disturbed and less disturbed. But that medical thinking still sneaks in, unfortunately. I guess that's my response.
Yes, the question was really about Engel's biopsychosocial model. So I guess it was a bit more specific. If you have any thoughts on that, or Dan.
Well, biopsychosocial, I guess it's very important for us to add the social dimension, and CSJT has a role in emphasizing that. The bio, I feel, from the standpoint of psychoanalysis, it's a huge distraction. I've been so disappointed with my colleagues. They've gotten caught up with neuropsychoanalysis. They seem to have lost awareness that the mind is not the brain. It depends on having a working brain, but psychoanalysis is about the mind, not the brain. Psychiatry is still caught up in all kinds of biological reductionism. Psychoanalysis, to some extent, some colleagues, when they became analysts, they really stopped being doctors, and they longed to get back to being a doctor again. And along comes this field of neuropsychoanalysis. Oh, here's a way I can become a doctor again and have something to do with the brain instead of this complex thing called the human mind. Well, that's, I think, all I can say about that.
I'll just say very briefly that I think the term, I don't know about Engel's biopsychosocial model, but I have used that, I have heard that term biopsychosocial model used with reference to a wide range of disparate approaches, some of which are more balanced than others. But in practice, I think psychoanalysis should be informed by biology, certainly, and neurology, but it shouldn't try and ape the field, and it shouldn't try and become it certainly shouldn't be a branch of it. I think that, and I think Freud was quite clear about this when he came out strongly in defense of lay psychoanalysis. And historically speaking, the largest number of activists and critical thinkers and innovators in psychoanalysis have come from the social sciences, not from medicine. They've been people like Erich Fromm and Erik Erikson, R.D. Laing was medically trained, but he was his training in phenomenological philosophy and psychology completely eclipsed his medical perspective.
Jean-Paul Sartre was his.
Yeah, I mean, he basically jettisoned the medical model completely.
Yeah.
So I think this is a very important question, but to get back to the term biopsychosocial, whose biopsychosocial model are we talking about here? And is it informed? Is it responsive to many of the critiques of biologically reductionist psychiatry? And more often than not, it isn't, in my experience. I've read. Let's see. I've got had this on my desk a moment ago. It's a book called The Philosophy of Psychiatry by Sam Wilkerson. It's a recent book, and I've read other books like it over the years that purport to be effecting an integration of the biological, the social, and the psychological. But in practice, very often, they turn a deaf ear to a lot of what the critics of biological reductionism like Laing are saying. And so I'm wary of that label. And I would say, whose biopsychosocial model are we talking about?
If I could just add a point there. I agree with what you said, but over the last 10 years, I find myself, despite my sociological training, I mean, Durkheim defines sociology as not psychology and certainly not biology. And someone wrote an article a while ago saying, why are sociologists nature phobes? And that I've always been a bit of a nature phobe in that sense, but my thinking is changing because I'm grounding conscience in biology. Conscience, as opposed to the socially constructed superego, is biologically based. It's something we share with our primate cousins. The recent animal research shows that primates are far more social, altruistic even. And then Bloom does that research with 3-month-old kids at Yale that shows that they already know right from wrong, long before a superego could be formed, long before social internalizations. Maybe there's some identification with their nurturing mothers, but we're primates. We come into the world with an awareness of what we owe to others. I mean, these little kids, they see these dramas and they always identify with the helping animal as opposed to the harmful animal. And this is grounded in our biology. So I've had to overcome, in that respect, my anti-biology. Bowlby sees attachment theory. That's a biological thinking. He worked with primates. We come into the world with an instinctual need to form attachment. So this is part of our nature, it seems to me. And yeah, we have to take this into account.
We're coming to the end. We really just have 7 minutes or so if we're going to close at 2 o'clock. There was a discussion. Kerry Nelson mentioned an article that he had done on the specific controversy, and I hope that people will return to that and look at other perspectives and have a larger conversation about. But I want to just end on a question by Nicholas Carveth. Is there any thought about how analysts might be disadvantaged or even harmed in their analysis by undue awareness, revelation of the analyst's personal activist political commitments, given that, as Strachey has written, we are already in the role of auxiliary superegos? Is there an urgency to focus instead on the patient's fantasies of our political and ethical stances as a matter of good technique? Can we separate our activism, what we do and say in the clinic? It seems like a large part of the conflict between traditional analysis and the social justice approaches over technical neutrality. So maybe, and there was another question early on, kind of about the future of psychoanalysis more generally. So maybe we can have our two speakers, or Eileen, jump in on that, on Nicholas's final question and the broader issue, and then we'll wrap up.
Wow. Let me just say that I'm very uncertain about the future of psychoanalysis. I'm going to jump in on that particular point because Nicholas Carveth's question is it's very, very complex and would require a whole separate hour for discussion, really. Maybe Dawn feels better equipped to address the specifics. I would want to have the question read back to me once more slowly, Neil, if I were even to attempt an answer, because it's very detailed and specific. But with respect to the future of psychoanalysis, I'm very uncertain. Dawn feels more certain that it's going to survive, if not thrive. I'm not so sure.
Mhm.
I'm not so sure. I don't, and I'm not saying this. I'm saying this because although I have been very, I think we're living in an era where things are falling apart, generally speaking, societally, and the death or the demise of one psychoanalytic organization does not entail the death of the profession or so and so on, but if my feeling is that if psychoanalysts, a sufficient number of psychoanalysts aren't able to rally and address the current crisis constructively and engage their counterparts on the other side, that it may discredit the profession. There's been a lot of negative publicity towards psychoanalysts recently, towards papers by people like Derek Hook and Donald Moss on the topic of whiteness, a lot of negative publicity about Lara Sheehy in the press, particularly the right-wing press. But even in the left-wing press, even in the liberal and left press, there's a recognition that psychoanalysis is in crisis. Conroy's article in particular addresses that issue. So I don't know what the future of psychoanalysis is. I wish I did.
If I can address the other aspect of Nick's question, the classical analysts used to very strongly feel that it was part of the analyst's vocation, like that of a priest in some ways, to bow out of public controversy into a kind of professional privacy. I years ago, when I first opened a website, I had conservative analytic colleagues very disapproving of the fact that I had a website that listed my publications and indicated a certain amount about where I stood on this or that. And that's mild compared to coming out openly and engaging in a particular conflict, like with CSJT. So I think people are less censorious, analysts are less censorious now towards people who speak out than they were in the past. But it can be a problem because our patients do identify with us, as Nick says. But I guess my instinct would be, that's grist for the analytical mill. Okay, the guy came across an article I wrote, or he saw me. He saw me at a protest march, so he's all upset about this. Well, what do we do with that? We analyze it. I don't think we should be driven back into an entirely private stance. I think we need to speak out. We need to be cautious, but we need to be aware that our speaking out does impact our patients.
Right. So I do think we have to think about wrapping up. And I really appreciate everyone's presence, particularly the current president of the American Psychoanalytic Association, who's with us today, fighting to keep that organization together. And I thank you, Dan, for coming. There have been questions now about, Neil, could you speak to the question of people getting access to the recording And there was also a question about whether or not Dan and Don's presentation will be published.
Okay, if you email me at McMaster University in sociology, Neil McLaughlin, I'll get people a copy of the recording.
Right.
There are no plans to publish my dialogue with Don and the questions and answers today. At least there aren't any yet. However, Carrie Nelson and I are publishing an article in Free Associations this fall where we do address the crisis of psychoanalysis and the impact of critical social justice theory on the field. By the way, I should acknowledge that although this presentation today is my own, a great many things that I'm saying are ideas that I'm sharing are shared by Carrie. And I want to thank everyone who took the time and trouble to show up today. It was nice to see the names and faces of old friends and completely people I've never seen or spoken to before. It's really gratifying. I hope you all took something useful away from this, whether you agree or disagree with Don and I. I think that we need to have conversations like this because the field is, well, it's in danger. I'll end on that note. Don, do you want to say something?
No, I think I agree with what you've just said. It's been a pleasure. Thanks for presenting the paper and inviting me to be the discussant. I enjoyed seeing Neil and I enjoyed meeting Eileen, and it's been a good experience. Thank you.
Great. Thank you all for coming. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Eileen. Thanks, Neil. Bye-bye.